Ron Paul is a U.S. Ron Paul is a U.S. Congressman from Texas who is currently vying for the Republican nomination for president, where he has shouldered the extremely burdensome, tireless, thankless task of educating other presidential candidates on foreign policy. Dr. Paul is the author of several books, including Challenge to Liberty, The Case for Gold, A Republic If You Can Keep It, and A Foreign Policy of Freedom. The title of Ron's talk tonight is Non-Intervention, the Original Foreign Policy. A champion of freedom in the United States Congress, a champion of freedom for people everywhere. Please welcome Ron Paul.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. One thing nice about giving speeches outside of Washington, D.C. and off the Hill is over on the Hill I don't get this kind of response. But it is a real delight to be here and be among so many friends and so much enthusiasm. The Future of Freedom Foundation deserves a lot of credit for what they have done over the years and the organization they put together tonight. You know, I think a lot about what's happening these last few days, and to my surprise, we're doing quite well, and I'm very pleased. And it's not a personal thing as much as it's a reflection of where we are in the freedom movement. And nothing can happen with one or two or 5 or 10 or one individual. Even an individual with a lot of money, nothing really happens long term. But I think what's happened in the last month or two has been a reflection that there's been a lot of grassroots work done by the think tanks that endorse the concept of liberty. And that's why I think Bumper certainly deserves a big thank you for his efforts over these many years. You know, the concept of non-intervention in foreign policy was never difficult for me to reach, although over the years it has grown on me to the point where I'm convinced it is the key, most important issue that we have to deal with right now in a political sense. And you know, it's not like it's something brand new. It's the information has been available for a long time. You know, I heard some advice the other day. It was given to the candidates in general and said, to be a good candidate and to get any place as a candidate for the presidency, you have to say that you're going to come up with something new and different and have a change. That sounds to me like a pretty good idea. How about like following the Constitution? You know, that's always a mixed bag, because I don't know if anybody had heard, there was a little whisper by Chris Matthews about something when I brought up, the original intent, and he had a big sigh and said, oh no, and this is generally, you know, I'm afraid the attitude of so many, that my goodness, they say, oh, you're just going back. And they bring this up especially if I bring up the subject of money. And, you know, I am pretty old-fashioned about that. You know, 6,000 years of history has convinced me that money ought to have real value to it. But they always say, oh, yeah, he's the candidate that wants to go back to the gold standard. arguing that that is the automatic elimination of this insane politician who thinks money ought to have real value. But you know what? I bet it's a sleeper issue. I really do. Nobody talks about it, and yet it's a key issue. Once they come to understanding how important that is, I think that we're going to get their attention. And who knows what's going to happen in the next 6 or 12 months in the monetary area. But you know, when I first went into politics, it was in the 1970s. I had studied Austrian economics in the 1960s. And I was fascinated with it, and fascinated with the predictions that the Bretton Woods Agreement would break down. And when that happened, it convinced me that the Austrian economists, were on the right track. And that was the reason I first announced to run for Congress back in 1974, after the disastrous results, the wage and price controls, and the terrible economic conditions of high unemployment, interest rates being high, and attack on the dollar. Even though at that time it was strictly for economic reasons I went into politics, over the years I have become much more interested, in a broader concept in foreign policy as well. The driving force for me in politics has always been the preservation of individual liberty. But the monetary issue can be easily tied into foreign policy. If you study all the wars of history, you can barely, if ever, find any war of significance that didn't bring about inflation. That is because governments are never honest with the people. They always say that it's important, they're going to attack us, and if you don't support us, you're unpatriotic. So the people go along out of fear. And then they don't have the money, they can't tax the people don't have enough money. If you fully taxed them for the war, then there would be a declaration, well, we can't afford this war. Well, they can borrow to a certain degree, but they never can borrow enough, so they always have to resort to the inflation to support the wars. And just think of what's happened since 1913. Not only have we developed a welfare state, but we've developed a warfare state as well. It's been going on almost 100 years now, and it is connected to the monetary policy, because the people would object if they had to pay for the wars that would be going on. And someday the people will have to wake up. Matter of fact, everybody in the country is going to have to wake up to realize that we can't afford this war. We can't afford it for a lot of reasons. I remember before we went into Iraq, I had given quite a few speeches about why I didn't think we should go. It really started in an intense manner in 1998, shortly after I went back to Congress. They brought up the Iraq Liberation Act, and that was an act signed by Clinton that said it will be the policy of the United States to have regime change in Iraq. Now, they brought that up under suspension. And when they bring something up under suspension, if the two leaders on both parties are for the bill, if you object, you can get the time against it. So they were so convinced that there would be no talking against it that I sought and got the time in opposition in 1998 on changing this overall policy. And it turned out that I ended up with 20 minutes, and the rest of the Congress had 20 minutes also. But I did my best, but it failed. We had a few votes that opposed it, but it passed overwhelmingly. The point being, though, is this, as bad as the conditions are under this administration, interventionism has been around for a long time, and certainly existed in the previous administration. Matter of fact, if you want to seek out and find out where modern interventions started for our country, it was in Woodrow Wilson. So to analyze this, we ought to analyze Woodrow Wilson and condemn his efforts to get us involved in World War I.